Record. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carly Lighthizer, and I'm the Extension Program Specialist for the UF IFAS Center for Public Issues Education in Agriculture and Natural Resources, also known as the PI Center. Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Tropical Season Readiness, featuring Angie and Enyedi. Angie is a warning coordination meteorologist with the National Weather Service in Jacksonville, Florida, and today's webinar will begin with Angie's presentation, followed by a Q&A portion. Throughout the presentation, you are more than welcome to leave all questions and comments in that Q&A feature, and if prompted, feel free to respond to Angie directly through the chat. Before beginning, I wanted to preface the webinar with a little information about the PI Center, as well as Florida Eden. So the PI Center examines how people think about, form, and act on opinions regarding complex agricultural and natural resources issues. You can learn more information at picenter.com. And I'm going to pass things over to another Angie on the call to talk a little bit about Florida Eden.
Thank you, Carly. Yes, so I'll talk a little bit about Eden, Extension Disaster Education Network. Eden is actually a national network of extension professionals throughout the country who work in the area of disaster management within their communities. We are a part of the Extension Disaster Education Network as Florida Eden, and we are a collaborative, as I said, multi-state national effort that is a part of the cooperative extension services across the country. And our mission is to reduce the impact of disasters through research-based education within our community. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Angie L. And with that, I will pass things over to Angie E, and we can get started with today's webinar.
All right. Hello, everybody. Let's see here. Let me try to share my video. All right. Hello there. Good afternoon. My name is Angie Enyedi, and I am a meteorologist with the Weather Service here in Jacksonville, Florida. And I appreciate the opportunity to present to you all today. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you see my screen yet, Carly? Not yet?
Not yet, no.
Okay, thank you.
There you go. I can see it now.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. So thank you to everyone for inviting me today. And I'm excited to share with you a little bit on getting ready for tropical season. We are already in our hurricane season, but we're not quite to the peak yet for the U.S. So I'm going to go over some different tools and some different resources and talk about ways to properly interpret tropical forecast products, whether that they're from the Hurricane Center or from your local weather service office, and then really guide you through ways to stay informed, follow credible forecast sources, and show you some cool tools that may help benefit you and yours to help you identify your local hurricane risks. And we talk about risk, it's not just the wind. We also have to talk about the storm surge threat, the flooding rainfall, and also tornadoes. So we'll go ahead and get into it here. All right, so far this season, where we're at is we've actually had two named systems. We ended, the most recent one was Bertha in the Gulf of America. And the chart that you see here is showcasing the outlooks that we get for the season. Colorado State is one of the entities that provides these long-range seasonal outlooks. And then the agency that I work for, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, provides their outlooks at a little bit later. So the outlook that you see here is for May. And I compared these outlooks to climatology, or what we usually see in the tropical Atlantic in a given year. And you can see that these outlooks from both Colorado State and from NOAA are trending at to just below climatology for this upcoming season. And we'll look at why that is here in a moment. So far, these are the names for the 2026 season, and we've had Arthur, and then we had Bertha just a couple weeks ago in the northern, which impacted the northern Gulf of America. So when it comes to seasonal outlooks and ingredients, if you will, parameters that meteorologists and oceanographers look for and across the tropical Atlantic or in the tropical Atlantic that may favor an above average or a near average or below average season in terms of the number of storms that could develop. These are the three main ingredients that are considered. We look at warm ocean water. That's basically like the fuel for tropical systems. We look at how much wind shear is present over the tropical Atlantic, basically how strong the winds are in the upper levels of the atmosphere. And then the other parameter we look for is how much moisture is moving offshore of the coast of Africa. And that can actually be kind of like the clusters of showers and storms that move offshore the African coast can serve as seedlings, if you will, that may become tropical in nature as they move across the Atlantic and head out towards the west or towards us. So in terms of the 2026 conditions, we have warm ocean water in place. That is not going anywhere. And not only is it warm, but it's relatively a deep layer of warm water. So think of that warm ocean water is the fuel. The warmer the water and the deeper that water is, the warm water is, the higher the octane fuel there is available for tropical systems to feed off of. Now, the ingredient that we do not have in place this upcoming season is we do not have strong wind shear. We actually have, or we have weak wind shear, I should say. So when there is strong wind shear in the upper levels of the atmosphere, that tends to shred apart tropical systems. And we do have, since we have an El Nino going on in the Pacific, that can actually influence how strong the winds are over the tropical Atlantic, which brings us strong wind shear. It means the winds are pretty strong aloft. So when tropical systems try to develop, they like to maintain vertical structure. And since we have that El Nino in the Pacific, it brings a strong wind shear over the Atlantic basin. So when areas of low pressure begin to form, like maybe clusters of showers and storms that are moving offshore the African coast, as they try to develop vertically or grow higher up in the atmosphere, the strong winds or the strong wind shear tends to shred them apart. They're trying to develop an eye wall or an eye structure, if you will, and strong wind shear shreds them apart. So we do not have good environmental conditions in terms of wind shear for tropical systems to form in the Atlantic. So that's that big red X. Now, in terms of monitoring for these little seedlings or these little clusters of showers and storms moving offshore the African coast, that's something we resolve on a shorter time scale, like in terms of weeks. And right now, there are a few little showers and storm clusters that are moving offshore the African coast. There's some, but by the time they move out more towards kind of the central Atlantic area, they tend to encounter that stronger wind shear and kind of get shredded apart. So we do not have that weak wind shear in place this season. So these are the parameters that go into those seasonal forecasts. And the large driver for us this year to see a below average forecast is due to the El Nino we have in the Pacific, which brings strong wind shear to the Atlantic, which can shred apart tropical systems. So kind of a cascading of conditions there. So it's important to remember that just because we have a low outlook, that it doesn't mean that a specific location cannot get impacted by a tropical cyclone. And the graphic that you see here, you can actually access this. I know we have folks dialing in from across the country, which is awesome. But you can scan the QR code there, and I believe we're going to have a link posted in the chat too to that coast.noaa.gov hurricanes website. And what you can do there is, based on historical hurricane and tropical storm and tropical depression tracks going back to 1842, you can select a location on that map. Thank you, Carly. I see she just posted the link there in the chat. And you can get a sense of what has been your location's tropical cyclone history. The radius, or that circle that you see on that map there, is centered around Alachua County, which is where the University of Florida is hosted. And you can see that there have been numerous tropical cyclones that have tracked within that 80-mile radius of Alachua County, going all the way back to 1842. In fact, that's plotting 146 known tracks. And when I say the term tropical cyclone, that's like an umbrella term that includes tropical depressions, tropical storms, and hurricanes. So you'll see anywhere along the Gulf Coast and going up the Atlantic coast, nowhere is immune to tropical cyclones. And the data that you find by going to this website will support that. Another note that I wanted to share here is we talked about how if we're going into El Nino, which we are in a strong El Nino in the Pacific, how does that influence the tropical cyclones that we get in the Atlantic. And typically, as I said before, we have a reduced number of Atlantic systems typically when we have an El Nino present. Now, going back and looking at the database, however, it doesn't mean that just because we're in an El Nino or strong El Nino, we're not going to have possible impacts from a tropical cyclone. So using the same tool that I showcased on the previous slide, you can actually still choose your specific location and plot storms that have impacted that area in El Nino years, or the opposite El Nino would be La Nina years, or in neutral years, not either El Nino or La Nina. And so you can see for my location that I chose, again, Alachua County, that typically we have more storms that impact the county in neutral years, which would be in the middle graphic that you see there. But over on the far left, those were El Nino years that were plotted. And of a database that goes back to 1950, we've had 19 named systems impact within that 80-mile radius of Alachua County during El Nino years. And you can see we had some pretty notable storms. In 2023, major Hurricane Idalia, which was a Category 4 at landfall, made landfall there along the Gulf Coast. And we also had notable storms in the 2004 season, which was considered an El Nino season. So we've had notable storms in El Nino years. So just because we get these outlooks, just remember the outlooks don't predict landfalls and they don't predict impacts. You could have a storm that stays offshore, thankfully, but still have impacts like flooding, rainfall, and storm surge at coastal locations. Okay, so now I want to talk about some updates from the National Hurricane Center to some of their products for this year. The first product I want to talk about is a tool. It's called the Tropical Weather Outlook. And it's a graphic. And the graphic that you see here, this is not the current one. We'll look at the current one here in a little bit. But a change to this graphic that the Hurricane Center has incorporated this year is that in addition to targeting areas of the Atlantic Basin that may have a tropical cyclone develop within the next 7 days, the Hurricane Center is also going to be putting on a gray X where there are areas of low pressure, but they're not expected to become tropical in nature. And so the way the tropical outlook is meant to be used is a heads up tool, okay? And so I'm going to use the slide that you see here as a teaching graphic. And so if this was a current tropical weather outlook, look at the X that's moving offshore of Africa, and it's orange. And do you see how that X has an arrow that goes off to the west, and then there's an orange shaded area across the Atlantic? What this is saying, what this graphic, how it's meant to be interpreted, is that somewhere in that orange shaded area, there is medium confidence or 40 to 60% confidence of a tropical cyclone low pressure area to develop over the next 7 days. Okay, so this is a heads up tool. What's really important to understand is that the orange shaded area in this graphic, for example, that is not an impact area. It is just where the surface low that may become a tropical cyclone could form. So this is a nice tool to kind of see like a heads up of areas that the Hurricane Center is watching for possible tropical cyclone development. All right, another update this year from the Hurricane Center, which is a pretty big one, is that on top of the forecast cone graphic, and we'll talk about what that is here in a second, is that they are going to be plotting the inland tropical storm and hurricane watches and warnings on top of the cone, on top of the white cone graphic. Now, the cone graphic is something I think all of us are very familiar with now from the Hurricane Center. You can see in the graphic here, I have an example of what the graphic would look like now. But first, we're going to talk about the cone, the white shaded area. Now, what that white shaded area is forecasting is the most likely track of the center of the tropical storm or the hurricane, okay? And what has been a challenge to try to message to folks is that a lot of people still think that if they're not in the white shaded cone area, they're not at risk of impacts. They're not at risk of the winds. They're not at risk of the surge or the flooding rainfall threat or the tornado threat. That is not the proper way to interpret the forecast cone graphic. The forecast cone is for the center of the storm, the most likely track of the center of the storm. Now, the point of overlaying the hurricane and tropical storm watches and warnings is to try to help message that the risk of the winds, the wind threat, extends beyond the cone. And so that's a change that you're going to see. In the past, it used to just be where the Hurricane Center would plot the coastal hurricane and tropical storm watches and warnings. Now we're going to overlay even the inland ones, which is really important. So let's consider the graphic that you see here. This would have been valid. And in fact, this product was experimental at the time for Hurricane Helene back in 2024. And you can see, looking at this graphic, the yellow shaded area, which is denoting where there's a tropical storm watch, extends up into North Georgia and even the Western Carolinas. The hurricane warning, which is the red shaded area, extends well into inland Southeast Georgia. So the idea here is to get better message where the actual impacts are going to be, and not have people so much base their preparedness on the white shaded cone, because the risk of these systems, hurricane is not a point. It's not a latitude, longitude point indicated by the dots there. Hurricanes and tropical storms are hundreds of miles wide. So the impacts from those extend very far out from where the center is. Another note I'll say here before moving on to the next slide is, remember that tropical storm and hurricane watches and warnings are messaging your wind risk. Okay, they're only identifying one of the hazards that can be posed to you by tropical systems, and that's the wind threat. There are other hazards like the storm surge threat, the risk of the flooding rainfall, and the tornado risk. They are messaged through other products. Okay, so just remember the tropical storm and hurricane watches and warnings, they are only messaging your risk of the wind from tropical systems. Now, a little bit, I won't get too much in the details here, but a little bit on how the cones are created, is that they are based on 5-year average errors, track errors from the Hurricane Center. And the width of the cone is determined by air radius that extend out from forecast points from the Hurricane Center. So I explain this better, I think, with a graphic, and that's what we see here on the page. So take, for example, this 5-day forecast track on the right side of your screen for Hurricane Milton. And I'm going to specifically look at the red circle. That red circle corresponds to having a radius or a line extending out from that official forecast point at the 24-hour forecast point from the Hurricane Center. That radius coming out from that H, which means it's forecast to be a hurricane at that point, is about 39 miles. And that 39 miles is going back and looking at the previous 5 years and looking at the average forecast air for 24 hours out. How far on average? And that is compared to what actually happened from the Hurricane Center forecast compared to reality. And that average air at that 24-hour point dictates the radius of how those circles are drawn at the different forecast points. So looking at our reference table there on the left side of your screen, you can see that at forecast hour, 120 hours out, that would correspond to the blue circle that you see on your screen on the right side. The average air there on either side of the forecast point is about 200 miles. So in essence, just kind of in summary, the cone is based on forecast track errors between the Hurricane Center official forecast compared to what actually happened over the past 5 years. And the exciting news is that the cone, when the cone started to be issued, this is a product that's been around for over 20 years, it was pretty wide. The track forecasting has improved so much now that the cone has narrowed. The confidence in the forecast track has become much better over the past 20 years when the Hurricane Center has been producing these forecast products. The next slide here shows you those trends. And I know it looks like a bunch of gobbledygook here to some, but the main point of the graphic on the left side of your screen is we're starting back, and I'm going to specifically talk about the early 2000s. Look at where the blue line begins on the left side of your graphic. That was the 120-hour forecast point. And you can see where all the lines, whether you're looking at the blue line, which represents 120-hour forecast, or the red line, which is the bottom line there, that's the forecast at 24 hours. You see a gradual decline, a lowering of that line as we go up in time to now, to current time period in the 2020s. And you can see that there's a steady decline in these forecast track errors. And so looking at the little chart there on the bottom right of your screen, in 2004, when the forecast cone graphics began, the average forecast error at 120 hours, or about 5 days out, was about 300 miles. And now it's down to 200 miles. Look at that 24-hour forecast improvement. Back in 2004, that was 100 miles, and now we're down to be about 39 miles. So there has been significant improvements in modeling, but also the skill of the Hurricane Center forecasters over the past 20 years. Another change, it's experimental this year, is that the Hurricane Center is going to be exploring breaking down the air. We talked about how on the left side of your screen, the forecasters at the Hurricane Center project out latitude, longitude points for the tropical system out through 5 days. And the cone graphic is based on the circles, right? The air circles that are drawn around those forecast points. What the Hurricane Center is going to be exploring with this year is breaking down that air and not just being an absolute air, but they're able to look at what's the along track air, basically how fast or slow the system is moving, and cross track air, basically the deviations to the north, south, east, or west. And so breaking down that air even further, we're going to get a track that's based on ellipses, not just circles. So that's going to be an experimental product that we see this upcoming year. Okay, so now to get into more of the forecast products and how to properly interpret them. So one of the tools that's available, and I think a lot of folks don't know about this, is an outlook that's provided by part of the Weather Service, the Climate Prediction Center folks. And they provide a graphic. It's called the Tropical Hazards Outlook graphic. And this is not the current one. I'll show you the current one here in a minute. But it's basically looking at not this week, but week 2 and week 3. And they'll target where the ingredients to possibly produce a tropical cyclone are coming together. And I wanted to show you this resource because this is a great product to help you kind of quality control some misinformation that can be put out on social media feeds. There is some dangerous information that's being put out on social media at times, showing a specific forecast model having a tropical cyclone making landfall 10 days out. And that is not good scientific information to be putting out that far in advance. And a good tool that you can use to help you kind of quality control that is going to this product. See what the experts are saying, see what the meteorologists are saying, given they look at all the forecast models that are available, even some that are not publicly available. So they're looking at all the tools. This is what these folks do. So help quality control and help kind of weed through some social media hype that might be being put out there to see what the experts are saying. And so again, this is a product that looks at beyond the first week, but in week 2, week 3. And you can kind of see what they do there is they target different parts of the Atlantic and parts of the Pacific to see where tropical cyclone formation may occur in the extended outlook. Now, we talked about this product earlier. Within 7 days, this is when we go to the tropical weather outlook from the National Hurricane Center. And this is the graphic I showed earlier, so I won't get too much into the details of it. But basically, I wanted to show you that there are some tools out there to give you an idea of tropical systems over the next 3 weeks. So Hurricane Center is within the first week, and then you can look at the Climate Prediction Center tool in the week 2, week 3 time frame. And here are the current outlooks. I pulled these just before our call today. So over on the left side is the current tropical weather outlook from the National Hurricane Center. And then we have the global outlook from the Climate Prediction Center folks. And you can see that for the Atlantic Basin, right now there is nothing that's being modeled from the forecast models with the expert analysis going into it that is of any notable concern right now. Now, it is important to stay current and updated with the forecasts because they do change and they will change. And I will tell you, like for me, I know this is my line of work, what I do, but every morning I check the tropical weather outlooks. I check both of these products to just see if there's anything that the experts are flagging that could be of concern for me and the areas that I serve. Okay, now we're going to talk about different products that are issued to highlight of different tropical hazards. And what I have here is a list of all the different weather and water impacts we could have from a tropical system. We have, starting on the left side, marine impacts. We have the risk of tornadoes and outer rain bands. We have the wind concerns, certainly from tropical systems. We have storm surge concerns, and we have the flooding rainfall risk. But we also have, once the storm ends, and it departs our area, then we go into river flooding concerns that can last weeks to even months in some cases. Now, the important thing to note is that all of these weather and hydrology hazards, they are communicated through different weather service products. And this goes back to what I messaged earlier, in that the hurricane and tropical storm watches and warnings are messaging one of these hazards, and that's the risk of winds from a tropical system at a certain location. But look, there's so many other hazards too that we have to consider. For marine hazards, we have high rip current risk, which can extend days, if not a week, before a tropical system poses any threat to land. The tornado risk, that can occur hundreds of miles away from where the center of the cyclone actually is. We talked about the winds, the storm surge risk. It can be communicated by storm surge watches and warnings for coastal areas and some of the larger rivers and lakes like Lake Okeechobee. But then we also can message the storm surge risk with a coastal flood watch and warning, which can be a little confusing. We have the flooding rain risk is communicated through flash flood watches and warnings, and then the river flooding is communicated through river flood warnings. So it's important to know what is your local risk from these hazards. Maybe you're not in a storm surge prone area, but maybe you have concerns about inland flooding. Maybe you're near an inland river that can rapidly rise due to flooding rainfall. So remember, there's multiple products to help message individualized risks when it comes from a tropical cyclone. Now, for the Hurricane Center, when there is a system, and in this example where we pulled Hurricane Milton from 2024, when the National Hurricane Center, that's NHC, starts to produce forecasts for a storm, again, they're forecasting for the storm itself, the size, the intensity, the track of the storm, and then there's a specialist part of the Hurricane Center, the Storm Surge Unit, that really dials in on the storm surge risk, the timing, and the peak values for a given storm. But essentially, there's a lot of different products that are produced by the National Hurricane Center when they start tracking a storm, if you will. The middle product is what we've talked about already. We talked about the forecast cone graphic. And again, the white shaded area is for the likely track of the center of the storm. This is a post analysis that was done using the current way you would see this graphic, showing the inland hurricane watches and tropical storm watches at this time step for the state of Florida. And you can see the risk of hurricane conditions extends well inland, the pink area on the graphic in Florida that you see there for inland areas. So this is what that product would look like now, officially from the Hurricane Center, plotting those inland watches and warnings. And so just remember the proper way to interpret the forecast cone graphic. I'm going to start on the left side of your screen. There are products that are issued by the Storm Surge Unit to help message the storm surge risk. The top graphic in the top left portion is where there's storm surge watches and warnings. But then the Storm Surge Unit also produces a peak storm surge forecast. and also a high-end potential storm surge forecast, which is important. So you get, here's the likely peak inundation values that we could see, but given forecast uncertainty, which accounts for those little wiggles and wobbles, you are also provided a high-end storm surge value too. So you can kind of get a gauge of here's what we're expecting, but given uncertainty, here's a high-end inundation value that you should consider in your response to that particular storm. Over on the far right side of your screen are the wind products that the Hurricane Center produces for a given storm. Now, the shading that you see in both the top right graphic and the bottom right graphic, that is a wind speed probability. And basically, the hotter the color you see, the higher your risk is of experiencing sustained winds of a certain magnitude. And in this graphic, we're looking at the tropical storm force winds, or the risk of winds being 39 miles an hour or higher. There are also strong tropical storm force winds, which would be the risk of your winds being 58 miles an hour or more. And then there's hurricane wind speed probabilities, which would be your risk of having winds that are 74 miles an hour or greater. So you can kind of watch these trends for your location and see how they're changing with forecast updates. Is your risk going up? Is it remaining near steady? Or given forecast updates, is your risk gradually decreasing? So the wind speed probabilities will really help you assess your local wind risk from a given tropical cyclone. Now, the top right graphic, not only do we have the wind speed probabilities overlaid, but we also have these black contours that are overlaid with a day of the week and a general timeline. What we also get produced by our friends at the Hurricane Center are the time of arrival graphics. And this time of arrival is specific to when the time of arrival for tropical storm force winds, that would be 39 miles an hour or more, are most likely to begin at your location. And so, for example, if we lived, and I'm not sure if you guys can see my cursor here, but I'm looking at the west coast of Florida. And I can see on this, in that band there, that Wednesday 8 a.m. time frame. So the way I would gauge that if I lived near Tampa, okay, would be, given the latest forecast, the most likely time of arrival of sustained tropical storm force winds at my location would be sometime Wednesday morning, okay, right near that 8 a.m. time frame. So these are some of the graphics that the Hurricane Center produces once they're tracking a storm. And you can get a lot of localized information from these graphics. I talked about a lot of these, but these are the tools that are available to you to help you understand your wind risk from a tropical cyclone. And the arrow here is pointing from left to right. And this is basically walking you through what is available when given a tropical cyclone as it's approaching your location. So over on the far left, the forecast tracking cone, that will be available early on. We talked about the wind speed probabilities and how you can use those to monitor your risk of winds of a given magnitude at your location. We talked about the time of arrival graphics. I'm in the middle part of the arrow now. Once we get closer to possible impact time, when we could start feeling those winds, is when we start to get another set of tools. We get the hurricane threat and impact graphics, and that's an actual interactive interface that you can click on a location on a map and get your most likely time of arrival. You can get your forecasted winds, but also a margin of error of what to prepare for, because little track wiggles and wobbles in the storm are going to happen. And so those forecasts and that tool with the hurricane threats and impacts interface is going to be updated to help you resolve your local risk. And then when we have high enough confidence that, yes, we are expecting to see either tropical storm or hurricane conditions within about 48 hours for a watch, 36 hours for a warning, that's when your hurricane and tropical storm watches and warnings will be issued, okay? So this is just to show you that different tools will become available given your location's risk. And as you get closer to the risk of experiencing those tropical storm force winds or hurricane force winds. Now, we talked a little bit about this on the previous screen. What does it actually mean for you to be underneath a tropical storm watch? And that's the top section I'm going to talk about. And what does it mean for you to be underneath a tropical storm warning? Tropical storm, we look for sustained winds of 39 miles an hour or more. If a watch is issued, it means that the potential exists somewhere in that watch area for you to have tropical storm conditions within about 48 hours. And then a warning is issued when we have higher confidence of your location or somewhere in that warning area to experience tropical storm conditions within 36 hours. Down on the bottom part of the slide, now we're talking about hurricane watches and warnings. For hurricanes, it's when we are forecasting the winds of 74 miles an hour or more. A watch, it has the same time frame. Hurricane conditions are possible within 48 hours. The warning is when hurricane conditions are expected within 36 hours. All right, so now we're moving on from the wind products to now the storm surge products. And I know there's a lot on this slide, but it operates similarly to the wind slide that we talked about. Moving from left to right on the slide, following the arrow, we talk about products that are available now that you can look at, all the way to, okay, we have a storm bearing down on us, then we start talking about the watches and warnings. So starting off on the far left of your screen, I'm going to talk about a tool that is available now for you to look at. And this tool helps you assess your risk of being impacted by storm surge from a tropical storm or a hurricane. And it considers a worst case scenario. This tool is called the maximum of maximums, and we call it MOMS in our world. And I'll show you this really neat interface that the Hurricane Center has that you can see if you're in a storm surge area of concern. And these MOMS, these are actually what evacuation zones are based on. Then we go to the mean envelope of water tool. This is something that decision makers like emergency management officials will look at, and we will brief them off for a given storm. At this point, we know this direction the storm is approaching us from. We have a general idea of how strong it could be. We know what our shape of our coastline looks like. So looking at this next tool, the mean envelope of water modeling, it helps us assess our risk from a particular storm. Now, once a storm is identified and the storm surge unit begins producing their downscale graphics for a given tropical cyclone, then we will transition to using the storm surge unit's products. We'll use their potential inundation map, that's the high-end scenario, and we'll also use their peak storm surge forecast. Here's what we expect. And then when confidence is high enough, we will issue storm surge watches, which again are a heads up of storm surge inundation within 48 hours. And then the warnings, which are a heads up that inundation is expected within 36 hours. Now, when we talk about storm surge, it's really important to know that that is in reference, when we give you a value, it's in reference to above normally high ground. So if you hear and look at this graphic here, try to visualize what that storm surge inundation could look like. You can see once we get to storm surge above 6 feet, that is covering that family's heads, right? Once we start talking about double-digit storm surge, that's inundation that could easily get into the second story or attic of structures. So when you hear storm surge values, try to visualize what that actually looks like to try to motivate your level of appropriate preparedness and response. Here's the tool that I wanted you guys to be aware of. If you scan that QR code, and I believe Carly's going to put a link there in the chat, there is a tool that the Hurricane Center has that you can zoom in on any part of the country and click on your category of storm to get an idea of how high and get an idea of how high and to what extent storm surge can impact your location and your community, because maybe your location, you might be high and dry and storm surge isn't a concern, but areas around you could become inundated. So this is a really good tool for you to help assess your local storm surge risk. And this is using that maximum of maximums that I mentioned earlier. It's looking at all the hurricanes in that category and seeing how high the surge could get. for all these different locations. And again, this is a worst case scenario, but this data and this mapping actually goes into modeling evacuation zones. All right, so we talked a little bit about storm surge watch and warning. The warning is issued when storm surge inundation is expected within 36 hours, and then the watch is when it's possible within 48 hours. Now, when it comes to flooding rainfall risk, there's another set of products that we use from our Weather Service friends at the Weather Prediction Center. We tap into all the experts. The Weather Prediction Center folks really specialize in rainfall amounts and location, and they will produce these rainfall outlooks. We call them excessive rainfall outlooks. And instead of getting really fixated on the numbers, right? How much rain am I going to get? Is it 6 to 12 inches or is it 8 to 14 inches? When it comes to helping evaluate your risk, those 1 to 2 inches off, it really, in the big scheme of things, especially days out from possible impacts, don't fixate on that. Focus on what is your risk. And that's where these excessive rainfall outlooks can come in. This is an example of Ian from back in 2022 of given, 3 days out from Ian impacts, where's the greatest risk and when is the greatest risk? And you see that's what these excessive rainfall outlooks do. They show you that there's very high confidence at this time of flash flooding to develop on days 2 and the current day 1 and 2 across Central Florida. So these outlooks can give you a heads up. And this is talking about not storm surge, but rainfall coming from the sky, water, and what your individual risk is using these excessive rainfall outlooks. And the Hurricane Center will post these to their websites. So you'll have access to those for a tropical cyclone. Flash flood warnings when we get closer to the event impacting our area. This is when your local weather service offices will begin issuing flash flood watches, giving you a heads up of flash flooding in the next 24 hours. And then once the event starts to unfold, then we will go to the flash flood warning. And when we issue the flash flood warning, that's basically saying, hey, if you're in a flood prone location, you need to be prepared to vertically evacuate or go to the next story of your home or a higher elevation if you should start having water intrude into your shelter location. Tornado watches and warnings, these are typically issued within hours of possible impact. The watches are example of that is on the left side of your screen. That all the counties that are outlined in red are underneath a tornado watch, basically messaging that, hey, as these rain bands occur, we could have tornadoes occur within them. And then the tornado warnings are issued by your local weather service office once we have rotation identified and we have confidence of a tornado being actually produced at the ground. It's kind of hard to see here, but there's in the graphic on the right side, there's a red box over on the coast. That would be Glenn County, Georgia. And there is a tornado warning in effect. And we actually had for this particular storm, this is Idalia back in 2023. We had 3 tornadoes touch down in those tornado warning areas when Idalia made landfall there on the Georgia coast. Okay, so now we're going to talk quickly and go into seasonal readiness. What does seasonal readiness actually look like? We've talked about all the different hazards associated with tropical cyclones, but how can you be ready for these hazards the best you can? Wind risk. Assess your wind vulnerability. Are you, is your home tied? Do you have roof tie downs? These would be anchors that tie your rafters down to the roof structure of your dwelling. Do you have impact resistant windows and doors? If you live in a mobile home or a modular home, are you tied down? Are you tied down to actual concrete foundation? Look at your tree canopy. Do you have large trees like an example in this image, unfortunately, that if they get caught by wind, they could be blown down and crush your structure. This is the time of year, ideally in the winter and the spring, you can look at your wind risk. Do you have large limbs that hang over your home? Maybe you need to get those trimmed, or maybe you need to take these trees taken out, especially if they're rotted or dying. So look at your vulnerability. Maybe you're in the peak of season and you can't, now's not a good time for you to have that tree maintenance done. But look at your vulnerability and maybe you shelter in the other end of your structure of where that tree could fall down. For our area in Jacksonville, we have 15 counties in Northeast Florida, 14 counties in Southeast Georgia that we forecast and warn for. And our leading cause of death over the past 24 years since I've been here at this office during tropical events has been trees falling down on structures where people are sheltering, or on vehicles when people are out driving around during strong winds. So the wind risk is huge. Identify a safe place in your structure away from any trees that could fall. Tornadoes. Tornadoes are a huge, are certainly a threat from tropical cyclones, and Hurricane Milton was a storm for the records in 2024 when it came to a significant, deadly tornado outbreak that occurred well before Hurricane Milton even made landfall on the southwest Florida coast. The image you see there is showing you all the tornado warnings that were issued, over 100 tornado warnings issued. And then the lines that you see there are confirmed tornado tracks. We had over 45 known tornado touchdowns. You can see a lot of those tornado warnings occurred in remote locations of the Everglades. So getting ground truth confirmation can be very challenging. But Hurricane Milton was a storm for the record books when it came to the massive tornado outbreak that occurred ahead of Milton. As I said before, these tornadoes in the outer rain bands of tropical systems can occur hundreds of miles away from where the center is, and can sometimes occur days out in advance from before even the system makes landfall. There is a favored quadrant of the storm relative to storm motion for tornado formation, and it is that northeast quadrant of the storm. So if you look at the graphic here, and do you guys see where the arrow says storm track? You can see that is how Milton, the center of Milton, moved across the South Florida Peninsula. The storm moved from west to the east. And so that northeast front right quadrant is what is labeled. And you can see a huge portion of that occurred where we had numerous confirmed tornado touchdowns. So that front right quadrant is the favored quadrant for tornado formation when it comes to tropical cyclones. They can occur in other areas of the storm, but typically we see the most tornado touchdowns in that front right quadrant. All right, when it comes to storm surge risk, what is your proximity to, first off, the coast, or also the intercoastal waterway, or estuaries that tap into the coast? For example, in Northeast Florida, we have the St. Johns River. The St. Johns River does get storm surge from storms that are impacting the Atlantic. We will get a rise in water. So consider your proximity to not just the coast, but also inland bodies of water. For those that live on big lakes like Lake Okeechobee in South Florida, or Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana, they have storm surge influence as well. And look at your structure's integrity and your resilience to storm surge. Are you elevated enough to where you could handle storm surge up to a certain value, but then above that, you would be at risk of having inundation into your structure? So look at your location and your elevation, and also your structure's integrity. But just remember, even if you're elevated, you may have access routes to you get inundated by storm surge water, or in this case, flood water from the sky, right? Flooding rainfall. So again, consider your proximity to flashy creeks and streams that may swell quickly when you get rainfall water, and also your structure's elevation when it comes to assessing your localized flood risk. Now, FEMA has flood zones. This is what your flood insurance is based off of. It is different than evacuation zones, which consider your storm surge risk. So check out your flood zone. If you're in a flood zone, that's going to tell you a lot about your flood risk given your elevation. Now, coastal hazards from hurricanes, one of the big ones that we can get even days away from hurricane landfall is a rip current risk and dangerous building rough surf. So look for hazard signs and flags that are being flown at beaches. When you start seeing those red flags being flown, that is an elevated risk and messaging basically to you that you should not enter the surf, that there are dangerous surf conditions due to rip currents or rough, strong surf. It is better not to go into the water. All right, so when it comes to readiness and stocking your supply kits here, we are going to talk about assembling your disaster supplies. And I know Carly's going to be putting in a lot of links here for you to reference if you want to, but ready.gov is a great resource. It will actually walk you through what should be included in your preparedness kit, how many days of food and water for each person. In the state of Florida, if you have a medical prescription, you can actually get to up to a 30-day supply of your prescription filled in advance. There are actually Florida statutes that allow you to do that. So please do check out that ready.gov kit website if you need more guidance on what to actually include in your preparedness kit. Things like phone chargers, batteries, a battery backup radio, if and when you do lose power. Keep your gas tank filled up this time of year, because you never know. You don't want to be rushing and having to wait in lines when it's time to start stocking up. You want to be ahead of the game, ahead of the masses, if you will. When it comes to evacuation and sheltering, this is when it's really important for you to know your local risk of storm surge, what's your wind vulnerability. Talk to your family and those in your household about where you would go, how you would get there, and if you have to go to a shelter, does the shelter accept pets? So again, another great resource from ready.gov. Visit that plan website to help you develop a plan. And these are all national resources. So no matter where you are in the country, not just the state of Florida, you can tap into these. Now, this is for the state of Florida, but this is a consideration for you even if you're outside of the state. If you or somebody in your household, or maybe you have a parent that might need evacuation assistance in the state of Florida, you can actually register for special evacuation assistance by scanning that QR code. But in other states, check with your local county emergency management website. Go to your county emergency management website, and they will have guidance on how to register for special evacuation assistance should you or somebody in your household need it. We talked about this already, but just to reiterate, there is a difference between a flood zone and evacuation zone. The flood zone on the left side, this is your risk of flooding from rainfall. The evacuation zone is your risk of flooding from storm surge. And the evacuation zones are what are actually used to communicate evacuations during a tropical cyclone event. So it's really important for you to know your evacuation zone. If you're in the state of Florida, you can scan that QR code that you see on your screen, and Carly will put a link to this as well. And you can go and see at the county level what evacuation zone you're in. You want to know your zone. So when you know if emergency management deems an evacuation order for your zone, it is time for you to head out. And this leads us talking about evacuation readiness. And this image is a great illustration of, even though your location may not flood or be at risk of storm surge, access routes to you can be inundated during a tropical event. And so just remember, if you stay, emergency services may not be able to get to you. And that is the point of messaging out evacuation orders. If you hear an evacuation order is in effect for your location, it means that you are at risk of being isolated or have storm surge inundation during a tropical event. Okay. So you need to be prepared to be self-reliant and not have emergency services be able to get to you during an evacuation order. I did want to clarify, and this is something I've recently learned too, that the terms voluntary versus mandatory evacuation in the state of Florida are only really referring to wildfire evacuations. They are not used during tropical events. So just remember that. Voluntary and mandatory terms, we're speaking towards wildfire evacuations. Voluntary is, hey, you might want to consider it. We highly suggest you evacuate. Whereas mandatory for wildfire only is life-threatening. Fire is on its way. You need to evacuate now. Now, when it comes to tropical cyclones, we issue evacuation orders in the state of Florida. And these are actual official directives by local emergency management. And an evacuation order is issued for your location. You need to evacuate. It's messaging that your life is at risk if you stay. Another important note here is that the evacuation orders are based on the storm surge risk zones, not hurricane category. We can have life-threatening storm surge with tropical storms. Okay, so please remember that. But right now, your homework is to find out what evacuation zone you live in. Okay, evacuation readiness. You want to be ready to go. You want to have your supplies assembled. You want to have a plan in place, know where you can go to ride out the storm if you cannot stay in your location. And don't delay, because there will be traffic issues the longer you wait. Where to evacuate? A lot of people think you have to go out of state to get safe. That's not necessarily true. We have a saying, move away from the water and hide from the wind. If you are in an evacuation zone, consider just moving tens of miles inland, not hundreds of miles to another state, okay? And consider staying with family, friends, or in nearby hotels. And as a last resort, you could stay in community shelters. When you shelter at home, you want to stay in an interior room away from windows to protect yourself from any debris that could be flying around outside. And make sure you're following official, credible sources of information, like your local news broadcasters and news radio. They will be broadcasting messages from local emergency management officials. If you have to go to a shelter, shelters are a place of recommended last resort. Look for other options first, because only your basic necessities will be provided at shelters. You need to bring your medical supplies and your personal items. And if you have a pet, you need to make sure you're going to a pet-friendly shelter. Not all shelters accept pets. Now, I'm wrapping up here, but when it comes to forecast, remember to follow official sources. The National Hurricane Center on the left, they're focusing on the storm itself. And then your local weather service offices, like who I work for here in Jacksonville, we downscale that forecast from the Hurricane Center to our local area. We tell you how high the storm surge could get, where it could get the highest, how high the winds could get. So we work together. We are both weather service agencies, the Hurricane Center and your local field offices, and we're working together to help provide you the best downscale forecast information. Now, this is my little wrapping up here, but just be sure to choose your forecast source wisely. We mentioned this at the beginning, but there's a lot of information on social media that can be not from official sources. So make sure you choose your source wisely. And, you know, some people are in it for clicks and likes. Your friends at the Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center, we're in it for public safety. We want to give you the best forecast information available for you to make the best safety decisions possible for you and your family. So just a real quick recap, 2 to 3 weeks out, you can look at the Climate Prediction Center, and then within 7 days, look at your local National Weather Service office and the National Hurricane Center to get credible forecasts. And then finally, I will wrap up here with an app that FEMA offers. It is an app on your phone that you can put in up to 5 different locations. It has multiple languages that you can choose from, and it will alert you of tropical alerts issued for your area, but all kinds of weather alerts, tornado warnings, flash flood warnings. It also has local shelter information and local information to your local county emergency management, which will always provide credible forecast information to you. I also encourage you to check out your local emergency management website. A lot of counties have free apps that you can download and customize to alert you to, based on your phone's location, of different weather hazards that are issued. So between the FEMA app and your local county emergency management website, you're going to have access to some really great tools. Okay, so with that, I am wrapping up. I know I filled up pretty much the whole hour, but just a reminder that outlooks, seasonal tropical outlooks, do not predict impacts. You need to prepare each season, and to please follow official forecast sources like that from the Hurricane Center and your local weather service offices. So with that, I'll push it back to you, Carly.
Great. Thank you so much, Angie, for that wonderful presentation. I learned quite a bit from that, and I will be saving these links. I dropped every link and more in the chat altogether. These will also be included in the follow-up email. If you're in an outreach or communication role, or even if you're just interested in the subject, I recommend that you hold on to these links somewhere where you can reference back to them when tropical season gets a little bit more active. I for sure will. I also dropped a couple upcoming events that we have, different learning opportunities about different topics if you're interested. And I welcome now any questions you all might have for Angie. We are running low on time. I'm not seeing many in the Q&A feature or any, but there is a question if, I know the recording will be shared after the fact, but do you plan on sharing slides to share images or anything afterwards?
I can, if you're good with it, Carly, I'll send you a PDF of the slides and then you can distribute however you wish.
Yeah, sounds good. PDF is preferred. So I'll include that in the follow-up materials for anyone who registered. Are there any last questions before we end the webinar? All right, not seeing any. Well, thank you so much again, Angie, for your wonderful presentation. I appreciate your time today. All right,
Thank you all. I appreciate it. Stay safe.
all right, bye everyone.